In today's episode, we explore why the biggest obstacles to clear thinking do not come from a lack of intelligence, but from our own natural instincts. This podcast is an invitation to recognize those hidden barriers and slowly move from instinctive thinking toward a more rational, fair, and human way of living. Critical thinking begins with a simple but uncomfortable truth: even though we all think every day, much of our thinking is flawed. It is often biased, incomplete, emotional, or shaped by habits we never chose consciously. Richard Paul and Linda Elder begin from this honest observation. They do not say that people lack intelligence. Instead, they remind us that thinking, left on its own, does not automatically improve. Like any skill, it must be trained, examined, and refined. Critical thinking, as they describe it, is the art of analyzing and evaluating our own thinking with the intention of improving it. This means stepping back from our thoughts and asking whether they make sense, whether they are fair, and whether they are grounded in reality. When we practice this consistently, the quality of our decisions improves, our relationships become clearer, and many unnecessary problems begin to fade. This kind of thinking is not passive. It is self-directed, meaning no one can do it for us. It is self-disciplined, meaning it requires effort even when we feel tired or uncomfortable. And it is self-corrective, meaning we must be willing to admit when we are wrong and adjust our thinking accordingly. At the heart of critical thinking lies a quiet commitment to excellence, and a willingness to challenge our natural egocentrism and sociocentrism. Every time we think, certain structures are always present, whether we notice them or not. We think for a reason. There is always a purpose behind our thinking, even if we are not aware of it. Sometimes the purpose is clear, like solving a problem. Other times it is hidden, like defending our ego or avoiding discomfort. Learning to clarify our purpose is the first step toward clearer thinking. We ask ourselves what we are really trying to achieve, and whether that goal is reasonable and ethical. Every act of thinking also revolves around a question. Sometimes the question is obvious, but often it remains vague. When we fail to define the real question, our thinking becomes scattered and confused. Clear thinking begins when we slow down and ask, what exactly am I trying to figure out here? Thinking also depends on information. This includes facts, data, personal experience, and what we have learned from others. But information alone does not guarantee good thinking. We must ask whether the information is accurate, relevant, and sufficient. Many poor decisions come not from lack of information, but from relying on information that is incomplete or misleading. From information, we draw conclusions. We interpret what we see and make inferences about what it means. This is where thinking often goes wrong. We jump to conclusions without enough evidence, or we interpret facts in ways that confirm what we already believe. Critical thinking asks us to slow down here, to examine whether our conclusions actually follow from the evidence. Our thinking is also shaped by concepts. These are the ideas, theories, and definitions we use to make sense of the world. Concepts can clarify, but they can also limit us if we use them carelessly. Critical thinkers try to use concepts precisely and remain open to alternative ways of understanding the same situation. Behind all thinking lie assumptions. These are beliefs we take for granted, often without realizing it. We assume certain things about people, about success, about life, and about ourselves. Critical thinking invites us to bring these assumptions into the light and ask whether they are justified or outdated. Every line of reasoning leads somewhere. It has consequences. Some are intended, others are not. A critical thinker takes time to consider the possible implications of their thinking, not only for themselves but also for others. And finally, all thinking takes place from a point of view. We all see the world through a particular lens shaped by culture, experience, and personal history. Critical thinking does not demand that we abandon our perspective, but it does ask us to recognize it and to seriously consider other viewpoints. To evaluate the quality of our thinking, Paul and Elder introduce universal standards. These standards act like a quiet inner checklist. We ask whether our thinking is clear, whether it is accurate, and whether it is precise enough to be meaningful. We ask whether it is relevant to the issue at hand, whether it goes deep enough to address complexity, and whether it is broad enough to consider other perspectives. We also examine whether our thinking is logical, whether the ideas fit together without contradiction. We ask whether we are focusing on what truly matters, rather than getting lost in trivial details. And perhaps most importantly, we ask whether our thinking is fair. Fairness means resisting the temptation to favor our own interests, or beliefs simply because they are ours. Critical thinking, however, is not just about technique. It is also about character. Without certain intellectual traits, even the best tools remain unused. Intellectual humility allows us to recognize the limits of our knowledge. It reminds us that being wrong is not a personal failure, but an opportunity to learn. Intellectual courage gives us the strength to examine ideas we dislike or fear. Intellectual empathy helps us genuinely understand others by seeing the world through their eyes, not just judging from our own position. Intellectual autonomy means thinking for ourselves rather than simply absorbing opinions from authority or the crowd. Intellectual integrity asks us to hold ourselves to the same standards we expect from others. Intellectual perseverance keeps us going when thinking becomes difficult or uncomfortable. Confidence in reason reassures us that honest thinking ultimately serves both personal and collective well-being. And fair-mindedness ties all these traits together, encouraging us to treat all viewpoints with equal respect. One of the greatest obstacles to critical thinking is egocentrism. This is the natural tendency to see ourselves as the center of reality. Egocentric thinking tells us that something must be true because we believe it, because our group believes it, because it makes us feel good, or because we have always believed it. This kind of thinking feels comfortable, but it quietly distorts reality. Sociocentrism expands this distortion to the group level. It leads us to see our culture, nation, or belief system as superior, while ignoring its flaws. Over time, this creates a narrow mental horizon, where conformity replaces reflection and loyalty replaces truth. The good news is that critical thinking offers practical ways to move beyond these limitations. We can learn to analyze what we read, identifying the author's purpose, the main question, the information used, and the conclusions drawn. We can evaluate research by examining assumptions, methods, and implications. We can approach problems systematically, defining them clearly and distinguishing what is within our control from what is not. We also learn to recognize different kinds of questions. Some questions have clear factual answers. Others express personal preference. And some require judgment, where multiple perspectives must be weighed carefully. Knowing the difference prevents unnecessary conflict and confusion. Becoming a critical thinker is not a sudden transformation. It is a gradual journey. At first, we may not even notice problems in our thinking. Then we become aware of them. We try to improve, often inconsistently. With practice, reflection becomes a habit. Over time, thinking becomes clearer, deeper, and more disciplined, until good reasoning begins to feel natural. The long-term vision behind this approach is the creation of a more critical society. A society where people do not rush to believe, where evidence matters, and where personal prejudice loses its grip. Such a society does not eliminate disagreement, but it handles disagreement with reason and respect. At its core, this philosophy reminds us that learning how to think is more important than accumulating information. When we commit to improving our thinking, we improve the quality of our lives and contribute quietly to a more rational and humane world. Thinking is something every human does. It is natural, automatic, and constant. From the moment we wake up until we fall asleep, our minds are busy interpreting the world, making judgments, and deciding how to act. Yet there is a difficult truth hidden inside this everyday activity. While thinking comes naturally, good thinking does not. Much of our natural thinking is biased, distorted, partial, poorly informed, or quietly shaped by habits we never chose. And because our actions grow out of our thoughts, the quality of our lives depends deeply on the quality of our thinking. When thinking is weak, the cost appears not only in money, but in broken relationships, unnecessary conflict, and a shallow experience of life. To think well, we must first recognize what stands in the way. Richard Paul and Linda Elder point out that two powerful barriers live at the core of human thinking. One operates at the personal level, and the other at the group level. These barriers are so deeply rooted in human nature that most people never notice them. Yet without seeing them clearly, no real critical thinking can begin. The first barrier is the tendency to place the self at the center of reality. This form of thinking grows out of a simple fact: humans do not naturally consider the rights, needs, or perspectives of others. We do not instinctively question our own viewpoint or notice its limits. Instead, we experience our thoughts as if they were direct reflections of reality itself. When thinking becomes centered on the self, it no longer relies on reason or evidence. Instead, it quietly adopts psychological standards that serve personal comfort and advantage. A belief feels true simply because we believe it. Another belief feels true because people around us share it. Sometimes something feels true because we want it to be true, because it protects our identity, or makes us feel safe. At other times, we cling to beliefs simply because we have always held them, even when no evidence supports them anymore. And often, we accept ideas because they serve our personal interests, giving us power, status, or advantage, regardless of whether those ideas are reasonable. This kind of thinking creates a powerful illusion. The person feels confident and certain, while being deeply disconnected from reality. Information is selected, interpreted, and remembered in ways that support the self-centered narrative. Contradictory evidence is ignored or dismissed. Over time, the thinker becomes blind to their own bias. This is not because they lack intelligence, but because self-deception feels natural and safe. At early stages of intellectual development, this form of thinking dominates. Decisions are guided primarily by personal benefit. Reflection is shallow. And fairness is sacrificed quietly, without guilt, because the thinker believes they are already being reasonable. The second major barrier operates at the level of groups rather than individuals. While egocentric thinking centers reality around the self, sociocentric thinking centers reality around the group. Most people absorb the beliefs, values, and assumptions of their culture, nation, religion, or social group without serious examination. Over time, these beliefs feel natural, obvious, and unquestionable. This kind of thinking shows itself in many ways. There is an uncritical loyalty to one's group, where one's culture or identity is seen as superior to others. There is blind conformity, where people accept group norms in exchange for belonging, even when those norms conflict with reason or ethics. There is a lack of cross-cultural empathy, where other ways of thinking are dismissed rather than studied. And there is a failure to recognize how media and social narratives shape perception through a narrow cultural lens. Sociocentric thinking creates a limited horizon. It prevents people from distinguishing between universal moral principles and local customs or traditions. It traps individuals inside inherited ways of thinking and makes intellectual growth difficult. Together, egocentrism and sociocentrism form what Paul and Elder describe as a serious harm to social life, because they block fairness, dialogue, and genuine understanding. When these barriers dominate, thinking becomes weak. Arguments lose objectivity and serve hidden interests. Complex problems are reduced to simple slogans. Ideas contradict each other without being noticed. And fairness disappears, replaced by loyalty to the self or the group. Overcoming these barriers does not happen by instinct. It requires deliberate cultivation of intellectual character. Humans are capable of reason and fairness, but these capacities must be developed intentionally. Intellectual humility allows us to recognize the limits of our knowledge and become sensitive to our own bias. Intellectual courage gives us the strength to examine ideas that disturb us or threaten our identity. Intellectual empathy allows us to step into the perspective of others and understand them as human beings rather than opponents. Intellectual autonomy helps us take responsibility for our own thinking instead of surrendering it to authority or group opinion. Intellectual integrity asks us to apply the same standards to ourselves that we apply to those we disagree with. Intellectual perseverance keeps us thinking carefully even when confusion or frustration arises. Confidence in reason reminds us that, over time, honest thinking serves humanity better than fear or blind belief. And intellectual fairness ties everything together, guiding us to treat all viewpoints with equal seriousness, regardless of personal or group interest. This transformation does not happen overnight. It unfolds gradually. At first, many people are unaware that their thinking has serious problems. Then they begin to sense that something is wrong. They try to improve, often inconsistently. With regular practice, reflection becomes a habit. Over time, disciplined thinking grows stronger, and intellectual virtues begin to take root. Eventually, critical thinking becomes natural, almost effortless, like a second nature. The ultimate goal of this journey goes beyond personal development. It points toward a society shaped by thoughtful citizens. In such a society, people are slow to believe. They wait for evidence. They weigh ideas carefully instead of reacting emotionally. Disagreement still exists, but it is guided by reason, fairness, and respect rather than fear or tribal loyalty. Learning how to learn, and learning how to think, becomes the most important task of all. It is the only reliable way to free ourselves from invisible mental chains. And as Paul and Elder remind us, if we want critical societies, we must consciously create them, one mind at a time.